Her name was Elena Marlowe, though in the service they used to call her Redbird for the way her auburn hair caught the desert sun. Years had passed since she last wore her uniform, yet sometimes she still felt its weight pressing against her shoulders, as if the fabric of duty never fully loosened. Now she stood in a small diner at the edge of town, apron tied neatly, the scent of frying onions and coffee grounds mingling with the rain-soaked air drifting in through the door each time a customer entered. She moved with the quiet steadiness of someone who had carried more than her share of burdens. The regulars noticed her calm, the way she refilled a cup without being asked, how her eyes lingered just long enough to let a weary stranger know they were seen. Few knew her story, and fewer asked. In the rhythm of clattering dishes and murmured conversations, she preferred silence. But silence could not erase memory. Sometimes when the plates piled up and the orders blurred together, Elena would hear echoes, boots crunching against gravel, the crack of distant gunfire, the hum of rotors cutting through a sky too bright to stare into. Her hands would tighten on the edge of the counter until the sound faded. She had learned to breathe through it, to let the present reclaim her. The army had been her home for 12 years. She had deployed twice, once to the heat-blistered landscapes of Kandahar and again to the arid plains of northern Iraq. She had lost friends there, brothers and sisters whose laughter once filled tents now buried beneath silence. Service had carved lines into her face earlier than time alone would have, but it had also given her an iron steadiness, an anchor she carried back into civilian life when everything else felt uncertain. When she first returned, the world seemed unbearably loud. Crowds pressed in like walls. Fireworks made her flinch. She spent weeks walking at night, pacing through empty streets under dim orange streetlights. But there was one constant that steadied her, the act of caring. She found small ways to extend it, whether folding a blanket for a shivering stranger or offering a smile to a child clutching their parent's hand. In caring for others, she felt the closest thing to peace. At the diner, her kindness became an unspoken language. She noticed the man who always counted coins twice before ordering, so she slipped him extra fries. She saw the young couple arguing softly in the corner and placed a slice of pie between them, no charge, as though sweetness could mend what words could not. These gestures were never grand, but they were hers. It was late autumn when the rain came heavy, drumming against the glass, as if the sky itself carried sorrow. Elena had been working the late shift when a man walked in, clothes soaked through, beard unkempt, eyes tired in a way that spoke of too many nights without shelter. He sat hesitantly near the door, almost as if afraid to take up space. Elena approached him without a word, placing a steaming mug of coffee in front of him. His hands trembled as he wrapped them around the cup, as though the warmth might slip away if he held too loosely. She saw the hunger etched in his face, the exhaustion in his posture. Without asking, she brought him a plate, scrambled eggs, toast, and hash browns, food enough to quiet the gnawing inside him. He looked up at her, startled. I don't have. Don't worry about it, she said softly, a small smile breaking across her face.
Eat.
You look like you need it. For a moment he simply stared, the words lodged somewhere between disbelief and gratitude. Then, with a quiet nod, he began to eat. She returned to her work, but she kept him in her periphery, making sure the coffee stayed full, that the warmth lingered around him like a shield against the storm outside. To Elena, it was nothing more than a meal. To him, it was dignity returned. Later, as she closed up the diner and the rain eased into a steady drizzle, Elena stood alone in the quiet. She wiped the counter slowly, her thoughts somewhere far away. A simple act, she thought, one meal in a lifetime of them. But sometimes the smallest gestures carried echoes she could not yet hear. When she stepped outside, the air smelled of wet earth and autumn leaves. She paused on the steps, letting the cool air wash over her. In that moment, her heart felt heavy but also alive, aware of how fragile and fierce compassion could be. She whispered to herself, almost a prayer, "Let kindness be enough." And as she walked home beneath the dim glow of street lamps, boots splashing through shallow puddles, She carried no expectation of what the morning would bring. For Elena Marlowe, it had been only another night of service, this time not in uniform, but in the simple armor of humanity. The following morning broke gray and muted, the kind of dawn that felt reluctant to arrive. Elena Marlowe rose early, as she always did, her body long trained to meet the day before it demanded her presence. The old habits of service never fully left her. The discipline of waking, the ritual of lacing her boots, the quiet scanning of windows and streets as if danger might still hide in shadows. Yet what greeted her now was not danger, but the persistent ache of ordinary life. Bills gathered on her kitchen table, unopened envelopes stacked in neat but unsettling order. The pay from her shifts at the diner barely stretched to cover rent, groceries, and the medication she needed for the lingering pain in her knee. A reminder of a blast that had torn through her unit's convoy years earlier. Sometimes the joint stiffened so much that climbing the stairs to her apartment felt like trudging uphill in combat gear. She never complained aloud, but the strain showed in the way she gripped the railing, knuckles white, lips pressed thin. She had faced worse, she reminded herself. But memory was not always a comfort. At night, when the world stilled, the silence filled with ghosts, she would see the face of Sergeant Collins, grinning as he told one last joke before the patrol. She would hear the sudden eruption, the dirt flying, the roar that swallowed their laughter. Waking from those dreams, she often sat in darkness with her hands over her face, heart pounding as though she were still there, still running toward the wounded, still trying to hold back the inevitable. The world outside seemed indifferent to such scars. Employers looked at her resume and hesitated when they saw the years in uniform. Friends from before the army had moved on, marriages, careers, children, while she sometimes felt suspended between past and present, as if caught in a fog that neither time nor distance could dissolve. She learned to smile when people asked how she was doing, to nod when they said, "Thank you for your service," as though gratitude alone could mend what was fractured. In the diner, she buried her heaviness beneath motion. She poured coffee, scribbled orders, carried plates. But even there, small reminders pricked at her resolve. The slam of a tray could sound too much like the crack of rifle fire. A car backfiring outside once sent her stumbling against the counter, heart racing. She laughed it off, shaking her head, though her palms were damp with sweat. Yet despite these struggles, Elena carried a quiet dignity. Those who knew her, even briefly, could sense it. There was something in the way she straightened when a veteran walked through the door, offering them a nod that spoke of shared understanding. Something in how she crouched to tie a child's shoelace when their mother's hands were full. Compassion was her anchor. It steadied her when memory pulled her adrift. Still, there were nights when loneliness pressed in with unbearable weight. Her small apartment held silence, like a container, every tick of the clock amplifying the absence of voices. She sometimes sat by the window with a worn photograph in her lap, her unit, all of them lined up in dusty fatigues, arms slung around shoulders, faces lit by the sun, and the reckless confidence of youth. She traced the edges of the photo with her fingertip, whispering their names as though speaking them aloud kept them close. On such nights, doubt crept in. She wondered if she had given too much to a world that now barely noticed her. She wondered if the people she served beside would recognize the version of her that existed now, hair tied back under a diner's cap, apron stained with coffee, shoulders sagging from weariness instead of armor. And yet, she knew they would, because they had all carried their burdens differently, but none of them alone. The struggle was not only survival but also finding meaning. She wanted to believe her life still held purpose beyond survival, that the kindness she offered was not just habit but healing, both for others and for herself. The meal she had given the homeless man the night before lingered in her thoughts. His eyes had carried a mixture of shame and relief, a reflection of emotions she herself knew well. To be seen, to be given without being asked, that was a gift she longed for too. As she closed the diner that evening, wiping down tables in the warm hush of dimmed lights, Elena paused. She felt her chest tighten, not from pain but from something heavier, deeper, the weight of resilience. She had endured battlefields, she had endured silence, and still she stood. Her hands trembled faintly as she rested them on the counter, and she let herself acknowledge, if only in a whisper of thought, I am still here. Outside, the rain had ceased. The pavement glistened under street lamps, the air fresh and sharp with the scent of wet concrete. She stepped into the night, pulling her coat tighter around her, and felt a strange calm settle within her chest. The struggle had not ended, but neither had her strength. And though she did not yet know it, the world was about to answer her quiet resilience with an echo far louder than she could imagine. The morning arrived with an unusual stillness, the kind that made Elena pause before opening the diner. She stood on the sidewalk with keys in hand, the cool metal pressing into her palm, while the air carried the faint scent of damp earth from the previous night's rain. For a fleeting moment, she thought she heard something, low voices, the shuffle of boots, but she dismissed it as imagination, the residue of dreams that had trailed her into waking. When she pushed the door open, the familiar scent of coffee and frying oil greeted her. She flicked on the lights, their hum filling the silence, and began her routine. Apron tied, coffee pot started, tables wiped down. Routine was a balm, each step grounding her in the present. But today, beneath the rhythm of habit, a strange anticipation lingered. It was just after 9 when she noticed the first figure outside. A man in uniform, his posture upright despite the years etched into his face. She thought at first he was passing through, perhaps stopping for breakfast. But then another appeared, and another, boots striking pavement in steady cadence. Elena stepped closer to the window, heart lifting in disbelief as she watched the line grow. Dozens of soldiers, men and women of varying ages, uniforms pressed and gleaming in the pale light of morning. Some wore medals that glinted faintly. Others carried only the simple pride of service stitched across their chests. And they kept coming. Elena pushed through the diner's door, the bell above it chiming faintly as she stepped onto the street. The sound that met her was the unmistakable rhythm of formation, the unified shuffle of boots, the breath of many moving as one. Nearly 200 soldiers stood before her, stretching in disciplined rows that lined the block. Their faces were solemn, yet their eyes carried warmth. She froze on the threshold, her breath catching. For a moment, she felt as if she had stepped back into the past, into the heartbeat of her own service. But this was not war. This was something else, something she could scarcely name. From the front of the formation, an officer stepped forward. His uniform bore the weight of decades, decorations carefully aligned, cap tucked beneath his arm. He stopped a few paces from her, boots clicking against the pavement, and saluted with crisp precision. "Elena Marlowe," he said, voice carrying with quiet authority. "Yesterday you gave a meal to one of our own. A man who once wore this uniform and who had fallen on hard times. Your kindness reached him when he believed the world had forgotten." Elena's throat tightened. She remembered the homeless man, the trembling hands, the quiet hunger in his eyes. She had not known his name, nor his story. She had only known he was in need. The officer's voice softened. "We are here to remind you, and to remind him, that no one who has served is ever truly forgotten. And we are here to honor you, for your service, and for the compassion you continue to show." The soldiers moved in unison then, a collective gesture of respect. Hands raised in salute, rows upon rows reflecting the discipline and dignity of their bond. The sound of it, boots striking once against the pavement, the silence that followed, settled into Elena's bones. Her vision blurred with sudden tears. She had endured years believing her service had faded into anonymity, that the world had turned its gaze elsewhere. And now, in this single, impossible moment, 200 voices stood silently before her, carrying the weight of acknowledgement she had longed for without ever admitting it aloud. Elena raised her hand, trembling slightly, and returned the salute. The motion felt both foreign and familiar, a bridge between the woman she had been and the woman she was now. As her hand lowered, she whispered almost inaudibly, "Thank you." The officer stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. It wasn't just the meal, he said. It was the reminder. That service doesn't end when the uniform comes off. You showed him, and all of us, that compassion is its own form of courage. Around them, the formation held steady, the quiet strength of 200 lives woven together by duty, sacrifice, and remembrance. Elena felt the weight in her chest ease, replaced by something lighter, an unspoken assurance that her struggles, her doubts, her silent nights had not been endured in vain. The moment lingered, suspended in air that felt charged and sacred. Then, slowly, the soldiers broke formation, some stepping forward to shake her hand, others offering quiet words of gratitude. A few simply nodded, eyes meeting hers with understanding that required no speech. Elena stood among them, the clatter of plates and hum of the diner replaced by the steady rhythm of camaraderie. She felt, for the first time in years, not alone but woven back into the fabric of something larger than herself. When the last soldier departed and the street returned to stillness, Elena remained on the sidewalk, heart steady, eyes wet. The morning sun had broken through the clouds, casting a warm glow across the pavement. She breathed deeply, the air crisp with promise. Her life had not suddenly grown easier. The bills still waited, the memories still lingered, and the struggles of tomorrow would still arrive. But now she carried a reminder etched into her very being. Compassion rippled outward, reaching places unseen, echoing back in ways she could never have imagined. And in that echo, she found her turning point. The street was quiet again, though Elena could still feel the echo of boots against pavement in her chest. Hours had passed since the soldiers dispersed, but their presence lingered in the air like incense after prayer, something sacred, unseen yet undeniable. She stood at the diner's window, apron still tight around her waist, her reflection faint against the glass. For the first time in years, she saw not just the weariness in her eyes, but also the quiet flame that had never been extinguished. That night, when she returned to her small apartment, Elena didn't reach for the photograph of her old unit as she usually did. Instead, she set it gently on the table and lit a candle beside it. The flickering glow softened the faces frozen in time, shadows dancing across familiar smiles. She whispered their names one by one, her voice steady, her chest no longer tightening as it once had. Grief had not vanished, it never would, but for the first time, it felt accompanied by something gentler, something like peace. Sleep came easily. When dawn broke, Elena walked through town with a new rhythm in her step. People greeted her as they often did, but she noticed their eyes lingered longer now, curious, warm, as though they sensed something had shifted. Word of what had happened outside the diner had begun to spread, carried quietly from one voice to another. A waitress, they said, honored by hundreds of soldiers. A veteran who had given without asking and received back more than she had ever imagined. She carried no pride in the retelling, only humility. For Elena, it had never been about recognition. What filled her now was not vanity, but gratitude, deep and resonant. Gratitude for the soldiers who had come, for the homeless man whose presence had sparked it all, for the thread of kindness that had bound strangers into something larger. At the diner, her co-workers teased her gently, nudging her about the parade. She laughed softly, shaking her head, but her heart held each word carefully. When she poured coffee for regulars, their thanks carried a different weight, a quiet acknowledgement that reached beyond the surface. Days stretched into weeks, and Elena found herself changed in subtle ways. She no longer shrank from memories when they surfaced. Instead, she let them breathe. The clatter of trays still startled her sometimes, but now she steadied herself with a breath and whispered inwardly, "I am not alone." One evening, she sat outside on the diner's steps after closing, the autumn air cool against her skin. The sky stretched vast and starlit, the constellations sharp as cut glass. She thought about the soldiers who had stood for her, about the countless others who had served quietly and gone unseen. She wondered how many carried the same silence she once did, hiding struggles beneath polite nods and practiced smiles. Her heart ached with a newfound clarity. There were so many who needed reminding that compassion was not weakness, that service did not end when uniforms were folded away. She thought of the homeless man, and how a single plate of food had begun this chain of echoes. If such a small act could ripple outward into something so profound, then perhaps each of them held the power to shift another's world with nothing more than kindness. Elena decided, then, that she would not let the moment fade into memory. She began quietly, collecting spare meals at the diner to deliver to the shelter on her way home, setting aside part of her tips to contribute to veteran support groups. She listened more closely to the regulars, not only to their orders, but to the unspoken weight in their voices. Slowly, she became a touchstone in her community, a figure of quiet resilience who reminded others that no struggle need be endured in isolation. Yet, despite all outward changes, the greatest shift was internal. She carried herself differently now, not in defiance, but in acceptance. Her shoulders still bore the invisible weight of the past, but they no longer bent beneath it. The soldier's salute had affirmed what she had long doubted, that her service mattered, that her sacrifices were remembered, that her life, even in its quiet simplicity, was of worth. One afternoon, as she wiped down the counter near closing, Elena paused. Sunlight streamed through the front window, casting long golden rays across the empty diner. Dust motes drifted in the light, suspended like stars in miniature. She rested her hand on the counter and let the silence settle. In that stillness, she found words rising within her, not spoken but felt. Today, I stand not only as a veteran but as a reminder that compassion carries forward, that kindness leaves no one unseen. Her eyes softened. She thought of the candlelit photograph, of the names she had whispered, of the soldiers who had lined the street, of the man who had sat trembling over a plate of scrambled eggs. Each thread wove together into something larger, a tapestry of service and humanity. As she turned off the lights and stepped outside, the night met her with gentle calm. She inhaled deeply, the scent of rain once again drifting on the air. Somewhere in the distance, she imagined she could still hear the rhythm of boots on pavement, steady and sure. It no longer haunted her. Instead, it carried her forward. And in that quiet stride home, Elena Marlowe felt a certainty she had long sought. Her story was not one of endings, but of continuance, of hope carried in small acts, of resilience shaped by both struggle and grace. She walked on, a veteran, a servant, a beacon, not only for herself, but for those who might one day need reminding that, even in silence, they are never forgotten. Winter pressed against the town with a steady insistence. Frost etched delicate patterns along the diner's windows each morning, and the air carried the bite of cold that made customers huddle deeper into their coats. Inside, the warmth of sizzling pans and the earthy aroma of coffee created a small sanctuary, a haven where people sought refuge from the chill. Elena moved through the familiar rhythm of her shifts, apron tied snug, hair tucked neatly beneath her cap. Yet something within her had shifted. The memory of 200 soldiers standing in formation outside the diner did not fade. It lived quietly inside her, like an ember that warmed rather than burned. It reminded her that every gesture mattered, no matter how small. She had begun to notice how those gestures multiplied. When she set aside meals for the shelter, others in town started bringing in canned goods or blankets to leave at the door. A retired teacher began knitting scarves for the veterans who gathered near the bus station. A young couple slipped a $20 bill under their coffee mug with a note that read, "For someone who needs it more." Elena never sought recognition for these ripples, but she cherished them. Each act seemed to whisper back, "We saw what you did, and we are carrying it forward." Still, the season carried its challenges. Nights grew long, and with them came shadows of memory. On some evenings, Elena would sit by the window of her apartment, candle flickering beside her, and let the silence draw old images from the corners of her mind. The sound of helicopters, the weight of sand in her boots, the faces of those who had not returned. These memories did not break her as they once had. Instead, they became part of the story she now accepted, the cost of service, and the reason compassion mattered so deeply. One evening after a long shift, she stopped by the shelter to deliver the leftover meals she had gathered. The building smelled faintly of detergent and stale bread, but voices inside carried warmth. Men and women sat together on worn chairs, some in quiet conversation, others lost in their own thoughts. As Elena placed the containers on the counter, a familiar figure rose from the back of the room. It was the man she had first served that rainy night, the one whose hunger had sparked everything. His beard was still rough, his clothes worn, but there was a steadiness in his step she hadn't seen before. He approached her slowly, his eyes carrying both recognition and hesitation. "I didn't know if I'd see you again," he said softly. Elena smiled gently. "I'm glad you're here." He nodded, swallowing hard before continuing. "That night you gave me more than a meal. You gave me a reason to believe someone still cared." And then he paused, emotion tightening his voice. "Then the soldiers came. I saw it. I thought I was invisible, but you reminded me I wasn't." Her chest tightened, and she reached out, resting a hand lightly on his arm. "You were never invisible," she whispered. The man's eyes glistened, and he lowered his head, shoulders trembling as though the weight he carried had been loosened just slightly. They stood in quiet for a moment, the room around them humming with soft conversations, the scent of warm food rising in the air. When Elena left the shelter that night, snow had begun to fall, blanketing the streets in pale silence. She walked slowly, letting the flakes settle on her coat, the crunch of her boots against fresh snow a steady rhythm. In the hush of winter's night, she felt a clarity she hadn't known before. Her life was no longer defined only by the struggles she had endured but also by the hope she now fostered in others. Days turned into weeks, and Elena found herself invited to speak at a local gathering, a small event organized by the community to honor veterans. She hesitated at first. She had never sought a stage, nor did she feel her story was grand enough to share. But when she stood before the modest crowd in the town hall, she saw familiar faces, neighbors, fellow veterans, families, and she knew her words were not about herself alone. Her voice was steady as she spoke of service, of loss, of the quiet battle to find meaning afterward. She told them of the power of simple kindness, of how one meal had become a beacon in ways she could not have imagined. She saw tears in the audience, quiet nods, hands clasping together. And she realized, as she spoke, that her story belonged not just to her, but to everyone who had ever wondered if their small acts mattered. That night, back in her apartment, Elena sat by the candlelight once more. She thought of her unit, of the soldiers who had stood outside the diner, of the man whose gratitude had cracked open the silence in his heart. She felt the threads connecting them all, invisible but unbreakable, woven through compassion and shared humanity. As the flame flickered low, she whispered into the quiet, "Let kindness keep rippling." The snow continued to fall outside, soft and unhurried, as though the world itself was listening. Spring arrived gently, as if the earth itself wished not to disturb the fragile healing that winter had nurtured. Buds swelled on the bare branches outside the diner, and the air carried the faint scent of thawing soil. Elena moved through the mornings with the same quiet grace, her hands steady as she brewed coffee, her smile soft but genuine as she greeted the regulars. Yet something had changed. The diner felt less like a place of transaction and more like a gathering point, a hearth where stories and kindness passed between strangers. Travelers lingered a little longer. Veterans, once wary, now found their way to the counter, where Elena always had a word or a listening ear. Even the younger generation, students, delivery workers, waitresses on their breaks, seemed to sense there was something worth staying for. One afternoon, as she wiped down a booth near the window, she noticed a boy of perhaps 12 sitting across from his grandfather. The old man's jacket bore faded patches from decades past, a history stitched into the very fabric he wore. The boy leaned forward, wide-eyed, listening as his grandfather spoke in a hushed but earnest tone. Elena caught fragments: courage, loss, comrades. She recognized the cadence of a story told many times, but never fully finished. And she realized, with a quiet ache, that these stories had found new soil here, nurtured by the dignity of being remembered. Outside, life seemed to echo her own transformations. The soldiers who had once lined the street returned occasionally, not in formation this time, but in pairs or small groups. They would stop in, take coffee to go, sometimes leave folded notes beneath their cups. Words of thanks, of solidarity, of recognition. Elena kept them tucked away in a wooden box at home, each slip of paper a reminder that kindness could ripple farther than she could see. But not every day was easy. There were mornings when the weight of the past pressed harder than the sunlight could lift. The memory of names etched on black granite walls, of voices stilled too soon, sometimes left her chest hollow. On those days, she carried herself slowly, like a woman holding both sorrow and grace in the same hand. She didn't speak of it often, but the silence in her eyes told its own story to those who had learned how to listen. It was during one of these heavier weeks that a letter arrived. The envelope bore the emblem of a local high school, and inside was a request. Would she come speak to the graduating class? The principal had written of how her story, passed from parents to students, from veterans to families, had become something larger than a local tale. The students wanted to hear from her directly, to learn what it meant to carry both burden and resilience. Elena hesitated. The thought of standing before so many young faces made her palms damp. She had spoken at the town hall, yes, but that had felt like speaking among kin. These were children standing on the cusp of the world, and she wondered what she could offer them that would matter. Still, she agreed. And so, on a bright morning with cherry blossoms trembling along the schoolyard, she stood in the auditorium, her uniform carefully pressed though long retired. The room was filled with restless energy, the shuffle of chairs, the hum of whispers, the faint buzz of anticipation. When she began, her voice was quiet, but it carried. She spoke not of glory or grandeur, but of ordinary days, of laughter in barracks, of silence after loss, of the way a single act of kindness could alter the course of someone's life. She told them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to keep moving despite it. She spoke of her comrades, of the man in the rain who had once been hungry, of the way compassion could ripple outward like sunlight on water. As she spoke, the students grew still. She saw them lean forward, eyes wide, hands folded in their laps. Some of the teachers wiped their eyes discreetly. And when she finished, the silence that followed was not empty but full of recognition, of respect, of something she had not expected: hope. Afterward, a girl approached her shyly, clutching a notebook. Her voice trembled as she said, "My brother's serving overseas. I worry every day. Hearing you, it makes me feel like he's not alone." Elena placed a hand gently on the girl's shoulder. "He isn't," she said softly. "None of them are." That night, back in her apartment, Elena lit her candle as she always did. The flame flickered, steady against the dark, and she sat with the weight of the day. She realized that her story had ceased to belong only to her. It had become something shared, something that now lived in classrooms, in whispered conversations, in the quiet choices people made to look out for one another. She leaned back, letting the glow warm her face, and breathed deeply. For the first time in many years, the future no longer felt like an empty stretch of road. It felt like a path others were willing to walk with her, carrying pieces of her story as their own. The candlelight danced across the wall, and in its glow, Elena smiled, soft, unguarded, at peace.